on. Okay, and Bruce, you're up first, and Bruce was able to join us. Originally, I was going to try to cover his part because there was going to be a football game, but Bruce is able to join us and give the update himself.
Yeah, due to the same ongoing weather that we've been enjoying for the last 4 months, they canceled. It was JV game. But anywho, technology update, school opened. We spent the whole time trying to get everyone's devices back in the hands of kids and get the classrooms back together and make sure all the projectors are working and people printing. And so we've been running around stomping out fires here and there. We've had some devices come back that didn't come back in June. So now we're processing those. Those students are still students, but chose to keep their device over the summer. So they had to wait till we were done with everyone else that was helpful. And now we're processing those devices and getting those students back online. It's been pretty smooth, really. It hasn't been that bad, just your typical type of agenda on doing all these things. We haven't really encountered very many problems at all. It's been very smooth and very nice, and it's been nice working with the new principals and helping getting the devices out. They've really stepped up and helped us as well, so it's been great. And other than that, that's all we've been up to, is hurrying up and helping people.
Great. Any questions for Bruce?
Just a quick shout out to Joseph Knight, who was really helpful on a couple of different tech issues I had, trying to figure out how to use Teams, for example, and update software and install software on my computer. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, Joseph is a great help.
I will add a couple of tech updates that I have also very much appreciated. We are adjusting to Teams. Teams is free in comparison with Zoom, which we paid for Zoom for 2 years, but it was $15,000 per year. We paid for it through ESSER funds, so it was no additional cost to the taxpayers, but it was one of the projects that we had put into ESSER 2. And Bruce's team put together a training, and Esther led almost all of that training on one of our very first workshop days, so that staff could get adjusted to using Teams as well, because it's a little different, and I think it's pretty user friendly. So I think it's going to be a smooth transition overall, but it's different enough that Bruce had the foresight to make sure that we got everybody as appropriately trained as we possibly could in order to start the year. So that was super. And then the other tech, of course, is always very helpful in getting the year started, because when we have many new staff, they have set aside some extra time to make sure that staff get the appropriate devices, but also appropriate training. And one of the things that we changed this year was, rather than doing a half-day orientation for new teaching staff, we did a full day, and it was primarily because of all of the tech. We have so much that we rely on for different software that we use that it really felt appropriate to expand that to a full day. So Bruce's team put together the majority of the training for that day as well. And then I got to mention one other thing, and this kind of dovetails with some of my work this summer, but nothing to do with curriculum really. But is school safety. The Raptor app is up and running, and Bruce's team has been incredibly supportive in making sure that the devices are working correctly, that the behind the scenes components of Raptor are up to date. When we have staff that leave and then new staff that enter the district, there's a lot of back work that needs to be done in the Raptor app. But his team also worked with the new staff to ensure that they have at least one device, the district provided device, the iPad, that Raptor is up and running on, and then optional for staff is to have it on their phone as well. We can't require that, but we have a lot of staff that do want to have that alert system on their phone as well, and then tech has supported that piece too. So very appreciative of all of the work.
And I'd like to add that my team did all that work, not me. I have a wonderful team. I'm grateful for who I have in today's day when you can't find an employee anywhere. The staff that I have has really done well for us, and absolutely, they work hard towards making all that work. I give them a shout out as well.
In terms of the training for the Raptor hat, Stephanie, is that something that you do practice, like lockdown drills with that and other sort of shelter in place, all those sorts of different protocols that we have in the district?
Yeah, so great question. I should back all the way up to about this time last year. Last year was when John and Bruce and I started talking about what we might need to do in order to expand our toolkit for school safety. And the Raptor app seemed to be a great fit at a very reasonable price. And then as we were planning for the school year, we were already working with Knox County Emergency Management, Candace Richards, and she offered to pay for the I Love You Guys training, which goes over all of the protocols, just sort of the protocols in general. And we wanted to make sure that all of our staff that were working directly with students, primarily our teaching staff, were trained on all of that language so that they could train our students and remind them of all of that language. Because although we were still using that during COVID, some of the lockdowns we would talk about practicing, but we weren't all clustering together in a corner. So we wanted to make sure that that training was fresh in everybody's mind once again. And the last time we had done that was 2018. From there, we also put together a plan to teach everybody how to use the Raptor app. We collaborated with or I guess I should say we did a meet and consult with the SEA just to ensure that they were on board with our plan. They had a really good suggestion that we take the health and safety committee that we used for COVID and transition that into a health and safety protocols committee overall, which was a really good suggestion because John and I meet and talk all the time, but how we communicate and putting that grand plan together doesn't always translate for everybody else. So people might not always realize what we've sort of got in the works and what's coming down the pike. So having that committee to bounce ideas off of and keep them informed has been great. So in April, I guess by the end of April, we had all staff trained in how to use the Raptor app and also provided update, just like a quick refresher on what does it mean to shelter? What does a hold in place look like? How do I find the emergency plans for my specific building? What if I work in 4 buildings? How do I find all of those plans? That's actually all in the Raptor app right now. And then over the summer into the 1st of October, administrative teams at each school will be updating their, it's called a functional annex plan. Those school-based emergency plans are functional annex plans. Those will get updated, and then I will refresh the Raptor app with those newly updated plans. And then the other thing that we're doing at the start of the year, we've already done 4 of these. They're reunification walkthroughs. We have 2 more that are coming up this Wednesday during our early release. And it's a walkthrough. We're not calling it a drill. We don't want it to feel like a high pressure situation. It does not involve any students except for 5 student names that we've gotten parent permission to be able to use the name. But really, it's going through a practice lockdown so we can test all the doors in the school. Law enforcement are interested in being involved in that process and sort of seeing what it looks like. It helps them get familiar with the buildings. And then from there, we have buses that will arrive at the school and take all of the staff to our reunification site, just as we would, except for we'd have many more buses and we'd have kids with us. At the reunification site, we've also invited any local EMS service workers to meet us there as well and talk about how we could improve our processes and what we might need. I've had some conversations with some of them at those sites, but really orienting staff to what the reunification site looks like, what the space is used for, and what their role would be in the event of a reunification, and doing it in a really low stress, low pressure situation. And then the Raptor app is involved because the alarm is going to go off at the school during a lockdown. Staff are going to take staff and student accountability within the app. They're going to shift that location to all students being at the reunification location. And then when we unify, they'll go through that app and they'll do 5 practice names. We'll pick 5 kids that they've already been pre-selected, and their parents, even though this is a drill, their parents are going to get a notification that Jody Tribo was picked up at 3:25 on, and it will say the date and the person that picked Jody Tribo up. So it's a kind of just taking the whole thing full circle and giving everybody an opportunity to be able to practice what their role would be.
That sounds terrific. It sounds like a really powerful app. It seems like it's almost perfect for what we need in district. So I'm glad we're able to use that well. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's been a great process, and I'm really proud. We've shared it with other districts, and I've met with a couple of other superintendents that have been interested in both the I Love You Guys training and the Raptor app. So we're spreading the word.
And if I could, I'd like to add as well that app does more than just the emergency piece of things. It can be used just for day-to-day use of people needing assistance and whatnot. It's a great way of communicating, and it is the cheaper solution that does more.
Yes.
Great.
Yes, and we are paying for that through the general budget this year, just so that we can maintain that going forward and not have to rely on the funding only through grant funds. I did ask Candace because usually EMA gets some sort of like a FEMA grant. She said that they can't purchase software through it, but it's not a huge expense. I think the total is $11,000 for the entire district. So, and it's a fee per school. It's no more than, I think it's $1,800 per school or something like that. So very reasonable for peace of mind that anybody can call that lockdown at any time. Any other questions about that or school safety? I know it's not curriculum related, but that was a big part of planning this summer too. Okay. I'll just mention 2 other things, and we'll get to some of the curriculum and data piece, but 2 other big things on the summer to-do list. One of them was invoicing. This isn't really specifically related to curriculum, but a lot of the spending that I do that supports curriculum and professional development and instruction is out of the grants. So we have millions of dollars in ESSER grants, and we have just a little bit over $1 million in ESEA grants. Those are our Title I and our Title V grants. And then we have lots of other ancillary grants. We've got a couple of state grants, like the juvenile grant that I talked about at the end of last year, the ELO grant. You guys met Molly Staples, who presented about the internships. So all of those need to be invoiced, and we got all of that invoicing caught up this summer so that we got reimbursed for any of the payments that we made, and we were able to do that in advance of Kati joining us so that she didn't have a big pile to do as she's first beginning the job. So that was a tremendous amount of work, but it was really good to be able to get that done and get us in a really good position to be able to start this school year. And then the other big to-do on the list for this summer, and this is curriculum related, is inputting in Power School. Power School is where teachers do all of their grading, putting in all of the new language that teachers developed last year when I worked with health, physical education, art, music, and world language. I think that's it, 5 areas. All of them had brand new language that was developed with new main learning result language. There was some of the language that was very vague and very broad that was adopted through the main learning results. So I do want this committee to know that we did take some of the local control liberty that we have, because this is a local control state, and we cross-referenced language to national standards. When you use national standards, like Common Core is an example of national standards, you're going to be able to locate a lot more resources to support your curriculum than just language that Maine has developed. So we did take a little bit of liberty. If you were to look at just our language and compare it to the Maine learning results, there's not going to be a direct crossover. I do have crosswalk documents, but we also tried to develop a little more specificity because some of them were very vague. So we did that work together last year. So those content areas have all new language in PowerSchool now that they are implementing this year. And I talked a little bit to the board at the end of last year as I was talking about the use of title funds. And I mentioned getting content areas and groups together on a more regular basis because the groups that did that work last year will need to develop rubrics. And then other groups, we need to work on a process where they're revising their language and refreshing their rubrics so that that work doesn't get stale. So we're in a really good position to get that work started. The first time that content areas and grade levels will get together this year is October 18th, the early release day, October 18th. So that's just around the corner. So that kind of sums up summer work. Any questions about that so far?
It's a lot of work. Thank you.
It was a busy summer, but it was good. We got a lot done. Okay, let me.
While you're going there, Stephanie, Bruce, can I ask you, and if you covered it because I'm late, but can you briefly summarize how you're going to move all your stuff over to the modular at the middle school? How and when?
I'm not.
Which is your? You're not?
I'm not, right?
Okay.
So really, we're starting new. A lot of our equipment in the server room has been out of warranty in anticipation of the move. In order to ensure that we don't have any downtime or any outages, I'm going to leave the existing server room intact and build a new server room and migrate the data over there, and so that the systems stay up the whole time. But we had intentionally not been purchasing equipment with thinking that this move was coming. Certainly we thought it was coming sooner than it did, so some of the equipment is a little bit older, but we're going to start out with all new equipment over there and copy the data over and just flip a switch at night, and people shouldn't get any downtime as a result.
Good. Okay, good. When do you imagine doing that? Like, when do you think roughly speaking, the switch is
So
clicked?
We're hoping that the space is usable here this fall. It'll probably take me a month to migrate in that fashion. So I'm hoping by the first of the year that we're more dependent on the new server room than the old server room. And the old server room will need to stay intact until the McLean School is no longer occupied, because that still needs to service those people.
Okay, all right. Good, thank you. Appreciate that, and thank to your staff. Thank them for us and all the work they did this summer. All the time, obviously, but certainly this summer. Yep.
All right, thank you.
Do you guys see on your screen something called cohort data study?
Yep.
Okay. Let me give you just a tiny little bit of background information. One other thing that I did over the summer, it was not time consuming, but I joined the Maine Curriculum Leaders Association as a board member. I've been a member of the association for several years, but they did invite me to be a board member this year, and I represent the Mid-Coast region. So with that, it means I'm also going to be advocating for other curriculum leaders, making sure that they have support and making sure that we get our questions answered, especially by other organizations or groups like the Maine Department of Education. I share this data very hesitantly. And actually, we were advised in August to maybe not share this with the board quite yet, because we do not have clear information on what this data actually represents. So we were told last year when we gave the NUIA assessment, which is now called the Maine Through Year Assessment, that we could expect to see no major change in our RIT scores. And our RIT scores are the scores that we measure. They match up to a national percentile, and then we use that national percentile to determine proficiency. We've used that same method in this whole entire cohort data study. But the spring assessment, which is now called the through year assessment, also measures proficiency of students based on 50% of the questions being below grade level through above grade level. So on an assessment that used to be you answer 50% of the questions right and 50% of the questions wrong on a very broad scale, and it's going to adjust your level so that we have a fair idea of where students are. It might be a fourth grader who's really functioning at a sixth grade level, or a fifth grader who's really working at a third grade level. We get that data from this type of an assessment. But when you have 50% of your questions one grade level below through one grade level above, your ceiling and your floor are really not going to be the same. So in hindsight, I'm not really sure how they could make that promise, but NUIA was adamant that we really wouldn't see a change in RIT scores. You can see from our data that we saw a pretty significant drop in our data. Some of it's only by 1 or 2 percentage points. But others, like for example, reading in 5th grade is a pretty significant drop from 59% of our students scoring at the 40th percentile or above. That would be the average, to above to well above average range, down to 37% of students. We don't typically see that kind of an anomaly in our data, which to me tells me the testing tool is not accurate. So I'm really pushing to get more information on what this actually means and how to best use this data. And if I don't get answers, probably what we'll do is we'll look at this spring data as baseline data, because I don't feel confident that I can really compare these current scores with how we used to look at this data in the past. So I'll briefly share how I have put this together. So this is years worth of NUIA data. I started collecting this in the fall of 2017. And I would always put all of the scores in for math and reading. We have assessed those two areas most frequently. This is a cohort study so that I can really compare apples to apples as best we can. So these are cohorts that have graduated out since I started the study. And this is adjusted so that we have current 12th graders scores. And of course, they did not take the assessment last year, but we have their historical data. And it goes all the way down to our current second graders who would have taken that assessment. So one of the things I used to be able to do in the past was I could look at scores, of course, from fall to spring, but I could also, over time, take a look at one area like math, for example, and see on average over time, this group scores around 56%. So this drop to 47% would be really concerning normally. I would say, oh my gosh, what happened with that 7th grade group of students in math last year? Well, we did have a new program that we implemented, so that could be one of the possibilities. But again, because this happened with so many grade levels and we were so far off the average, my assumption is that we can't rely on the testing to give us the same type of data as the previous tests.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, these are averages. So going back to like the 5th grade math, that's a national average, or is that just an absolute average? Because I'm thinking about, or I'm sorry, the 5th grade reading, I'm thinking about those kids 2 years ago being in 3rd grade, being such a pivotal year for learning about reading. That's where kids often go from learning how to read to reading how to learn. And I'm wondering if, they were impacted disproportionately during the pandemic as 3rd graders, or are we just comparing ourselves to every 5th grader who's taking the NUI test throughout the country?
So this is actually not comparing, well, it's comparing a couple of things, but I would not make that conclusion about there's a sudden drop for these students as being affected in third grade, because when you look at these past scores, it doesn't seem accurate that all of a sudden in just the spring only of their fifth grade year, there's this significant drop.
Got it.
So the way that these are derived, I've got a little message here at the top. So this data refers to the grade report from NUIA representing the overall performance in math and reading through a norm referenced assessment. The percent performing comes from the total percent of students in the average through the high range. So I don't have one of the pictures in front of me, but we get this rainbow colored picture with 5 areas on it. And I'll show you an example from iReady in a moment. It breaks it down similar, but the categories in NUIA are low, low average, average, high average, and high. We look at average, high average, and high. We look at the percentage of students that score in those areas, and we're considering those proficient because the average includes the students at the 50th percentile, so that's where they're being normed to other students across the country, but it also, their average includes about 10 points of standard deviation, so you're also capturing the 40% and the 60% within that average. So our number on here, this fifth grade, 37%, for example, 37% of our fifth graders scored average or higher on this assessment. Whereas in the fall, 59% of our fifth graders scored in the average or higher. So that's what doesn't quite add up for me, is this huge discrepancy. Why the sudden drop? The only variable for us that has changed is the test.
I have a question, Stephanie, and it's this. One of the reasons that we like the NUIA is because it was a norm reference test comparing our students' performance to a national sample. The through year assessment that has just been created, that is not a national test, is it? It's just for Maine, is it not?
Well, correct. So the through year assessment, they're still comparing the RIT score to a national average, but the proficiency, I can't remember what it's called. It's not goal setting, but it's like target setting to determine the levels of proficiencies for students. That is done locally, and that actually was done by teachers. We had some teachers, we had a math teacher from middle school that was involved in that process.
So isn't that in effect turning a norm reference test to a criterion reference test if they artificially set the comparison?
Correct. It is going to be both. It is going to be you'll get, this is the norm, so you'll get this RIT score. But then eventually, and we've not been provided this yet, eventually there will also be a proficiency rating that is provided in a report. And I have no idea what that's going to look like, but we've not received that yet. I think in early October, we're supposed to be getting that data.
That's the same thing they did with the MEA when they destroyed the baseline and we had no longer anything to compare it to.
Right.
So now that's making a lot more sense to me. I don't know if it makes more sense to the committee, but if you take a nationally normed test and then artificially set, or I don't know, arbitrary is the right word, but if you do it with state standards, now you've changed the whole ballgame of that test. So does that make sense to folks, what I'm talking about?
Is that what they did?
Apparently that's what they did.
That's what they did, and that's why we're getting the different NUIA test scores for spring specifically. Is that that's what you're figuring out right now?
So if that's true, we're going to actually have to have. I think Stephanie's right on the money when she says consider it baseline data.
I think
that's the first year they did it. That's what it is, baseline data.
Why would they switch it in the middle of the school year?
Well, that's a really good question. So, and this goes back to maybe some of my frustrations last year with a lot of the requests that we were getting from the state. And this is not the state's fault. It sort of is just the whole situation that education is in. But a lot of this goes back to compliance. So we have to be compliant in requiring 95% of our population to take the assessment. But the state also has to be compliant in the way that their assessment is set up. And I think the state recognized, especially during COVID, a lot of people are already using NUIA. We love it. It's a great measure. But in order to continue using NUIA as a state level assessment, it has to meet a certain threshold of requirements, which includes having a proficiency-based measure. And in order for Maine to do that, they had to work from feedback from the US Department of Education. And in fact, they were on a really tight timeline. I don't know if you read any articles about the possible loss of Title I funding for Maine last year, but that was one of the things that was on the table if Maine didn't get this assessment figured out in a timely manner. So I think there's multiple layers at play, and certainly they affect schools. This was a big source of data and decision making for us that now it's challenging to be able to trust this data. And I know I'm not unique in feeling that way. When we met as an MCLA group across the entire state last week, this was the conversation that came up again, is when are we going to get more clarification on how we can actually use this data?
So other districts are saying the same phenomenon?
Yes. Yes.
Also, I forgot to say I have a hard out at 4.
Oh, okay. Well,
Okay.
let me then, because this is sort of like, okay, what are we supposed to use? How do we know how we did last year? We do have other measures. So I will show you one of the other measures. It is the iReady assessment for math, which we use for grades K through 8. So we do have a great math measure for grades K through 8. And we also have school-based measures for reading that we do continue to use. So it's not like NUIA is our only source of data. We did find it very valuable. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that going forward, we might have to rethink how we're using this data, and it might become baseline and we're starting over. I got to stop sharing for 1 second so that when I reshare, I can share this other data, which I have in a PDF. And let me make sure you're seeing the right thing. Do you guys see a document that says iReady at the top?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is our iReady diagnostic results, and it's specific to math. This assessment is showing fall of last year compared to spring of last year. So this spring is where we ended the school year. Whenever we begin the school year and students take the assessment in the fall, it's okay to see all of this yellow, even though that looks kind of scary. Yellow is 1 grade level behind, which actually means that those kids completed the previous year's learning and they're ready to start their instruction. So they actually didn't begin the year in too bad of a place, although we always want to shrink these red areas. This 19% in the fall are our students who are 2 grade levels below. And this darker red area is our students who are 3 or more grade levels below. So those areas are concerning, and that's a pretty good chunk of students that are still scoring in that area. In the fall, it was 162 students. This is grades 1 through 8. Kindergarteners can never be 2 or more grade levels below. So grades 1 through 8. And then in the students who were 3 or more grade levels below, grades 2 through 8, there were 118 students. So those are pretty big numbers, even though we are talking hundreds of students. It was 843 students that we had both a fall and a spring score for that we could do a data comparison. But good news, in the spring, when we looked at where students are by the end of the year, the goal is to shrink this and fill it with as much green as possible, and certainly to shrink these red areas. And we did both of those. So in the spring, we had 26% of our students in grades K through 8 scoring mid or above grade level. 23% were early on grade level. 35% were 1 grade level below. Now at the end of the year, you don't want to see as much yellow because by that point you want them to at least be experiencing some early on grade level or mid to above grade level content. 7%, so this shrunk from 19% to 7% for students who were 2 grade levels or below. And then this more concerning 3 grade levels or below shrunk from 14% to 10%. So that looks a lot more positive when we look at that versus the NUIA data. And then I did want to share with you, this is not finished yet. We've only assessed 642 of our students currently this fall. I think when I last looked at it, we've assessed 67% of our population. So this data is not complete yet, but I thought you might be interested in how are we doing so far this fall? How are things looking? Again, we expect to see a fair amount in this yellow area. We want students to be starting the year as completing the last year and be ready for learning this year. These students are a little bit ahead. These students are a little bit behind. You can see that these areas at the start of this school year echo, I actually think it's the same amount. I think it's 34%. We had 34% last year as well that were in that same situation. So as long as we continue to see that shrinking, the students that are multiple grade levels below are going to continue to show up that way until we can shrink more of those red areas. And that's data overall for the whole district. So I did break it down a little bit more for you. This is spring of 2023. I think the most important thing to see here is this is a little more concerning. This red area does increase with each grade level that we go up because the content becomes harder. The kids that are behind then start to become multiple grade levels behind. So the goal is to really try to shrink those red areas as much as possible. But we also are seeing a lot of growth here in these green areas when we compare them to the fall. My biggest concern, well, first of all, 5th grade is a little bit of an outlier in a smaller number of students that are in the green area and a larger number of students that are in the red area. Brad, you already indicated this. Those 5th graders, there currently are 6th graders. Those kids were the most affected by COVID overall, both in reading and in math. Math is a bit more severe. So they're a little bit more of an anomaly, but I was also equally concerned about the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade scores from last year. But one thing to keep in mind, I know I talked about this quite a bit with the committee last year, we were in a brand new implementation of a new math program. So there's a little bit of a shift as we're getting more into that program. One of the things I did this summer was I requested another training. And starting from scratch with that training, because I had learned that the trainer that had provided our original training, I sat through that training. I did not think it was great. If I was a new teacher of that program, I probably would have been like, I'm not quite sure how to start or where to start. And although we had a few follow-up trainings, it felt like a rocky start. So when I shared that with the company, they provided an additional training at no cost to us because they agreed we really needed a fresh start. So I think we're going to be in a better space with that this year and going forward, but I do want you guys to know that I'm paying really close attention to the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math implementation as we continue to move forward as well. What else is
Stephanie, one thing I noticed on the previous one, was that you had quite a few lesser students in the 8th grade testing than you did for other grades. How do you account for that? So the total students assessed was 79, where the other grades, and 7th grade too. So would that also skew the outcome?
It would skew the outcome, and I'll tell you why that probably really skews the outcome. The kids that did not take the assessment were our Algebra 1 kids, who probably would have done quite well on the assessment. And I think part of that accounts for such a low score here as well. I was not aware that they did not take the assessment until after the fact, but I think the rationale was because those kids already had to do another test to sort of like an end of the year assessment as they're moving into their high school math and determining what their placement would be there. So I think the teachers made the decision not to have them do that assessment. But I would have advocated that we have this data as well. So that definitely would skew that 8th grade data.
Well, in 7th grade too, because those numbers, although that's on Algebra 2, but that also, we still have 50% of the 8th graders below at least one grade level, if not more. So, okay.
Yeah.
Of the ones who are tested. All right.
Yeah.
And also last year, the numbers, the green from fall to spring, while there's more green, it seems that the space that's yellow, if I recall, and I may have this off, is that amount has not shifted very much year over year in terms of the number of students. Well, we have the green, the yellow stays the same. So like the red portion gets smaller, the green goes up, but yellow stays the same.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that is because some of the kids that might be 3 or 2 grade levels below might be learning and making growth, but they're probably not jumping into the green. They're probably filling that yellow bar, and now they're 1 grade level behind. So they're closing the gap, but that might mean our yellow is not going to decrease significantly because the numbers that are from that red are really moving up to the yellow. It's unlikely that they're moving up to the green.
Okay, thanks.
That's a really good question.
I have to leave. I'm so sorry.
Okay, thank you.
I'll watch the rest of the recording.
Okay, sounds good.
See ya. Have a good night.
Any other questions about the iReady data?
I know that we're obviously trying to shrink the red. I'm wondering if there's anything more we can do as a board or anything we can do to support you and your team to maybe think about how those kids could catch up maybe over the summer or through other types of programs, differentiated learning, different curricula, whatever it may be, so that they can, I'm not asking for miracles, but just take a significant step toward that yellow zone and eventually, feeling good and successful, they can maybe even get into the green zone. Is there more that we could be doing as a district to get them there?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I think there's 2 things. I think one of them probably has some overlap with the student engagement task force. Engagement is huge. And one of the things, I just met with the 6th grade team. John and I met with them at the end of last year. And one of the things I shared actually came from an iReady conference about how do we improve our math scores in middle school. And none of what we were provided from these math experts was about math. It was all about engagement and relationships. And I think sometimes in middle school, our kids become significantly less engaged because of everything else that's going on in their lives and changes that they're going through. But one of the studies that they shared was the more relationships that kids have. They asked the question to students in a school where they did this study, name the kids that you would want to have as locker buddies. And then they did like a cross-reference of how many times each name came up. And then they layered that data on top of math data. They layered that data on top of ELA data. They layered it on top of attendance and homework completion. And every single time, the most names that came up, if the student's name came up the most times, they had the highest scores. And then it decreased from there. The fewer times a student's name came up, the lower everything was across the board. So I definitely think that area is just going to be a continued area where we need to improve that engagement. I experienced that firsthand last year. You are not going to see assessment data for iReady from any of the kids that I worked with in the program. There was complete refusal to test, and it was not a top priority to get those students to test because it caused so much anxiety. I think if we could build the relationships enough to get students to a point where they want to engage in academics and they want to be engaged and they feel good about school, I think we're going to see some of those test scores increase. So that's number one, the student engagement. Number two, and I want to prep you guys and maybe think into December when we want to pull in Laura Lapointe to talk about after school and summer programming. We're not specifically focused on math or ELA under those umbrellas, but we're focused on really doing a lot of skill building and relationship building and engagement and enrichment. Those are other ways that students start to become more engaged with their peers and more engaged with learning. And we want to make sure Laura's done a tremendous job, but everything that she's done has been ESSER funded. And I think we want to find a way to try to get these programs into our budget. We talked about numbers today. Everything that she's doing is really reasonable, but I think we want to be strategic about how we move forward with some of that programming. So I just want to also put that on your radar and make sure that we revisit that conversation at some point too, and invite Laura to talk a little bit more about that programming.
That's great, Stephanie, and I totally agree. And I've actually seen that study where those relationships are absolutely key for student engagement, because they, kids want to go to school more, that their absentee rates are going to go down. And of course, especially if we can develop really strong relationships with their teachers as well, even though they might not be locker mates, they might be someone that can really, care for them. That caring adult theme that we've been talking about in the district for a long time, I think is going to be really key. So when we have our student engagement task force meeting, I hope that you can bring up that point and we can discuss that a little bit further. Maybe we can even develop some strategies to facilitate some of those relationship building things. Maybe there are things that other districts have done that have been successful that we don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. But I would like to see us to look at that. But I also think it might be a multi-pronged approach. Maybe there are programs that we can recommend for certain students who are, 2 or 3 years behind, that can work with students more intensively over the summer, or, at other times to support those families to get them more engaged. And I'm just curious to hear, maybe not today, but at some point, other strategies we can do to again, shrink the red, increase the green, and get all the kids, fully engaged in the learning process here.
Well, and I think once we're in a better position with the business office and managing all of our grants, I think we've done a good job, but we've got a lot of grants going on right now. ESSER 2 is sunsetting, so that's going to be one thing off of the plate. But another thing that we could consider that is grant funding is Title I. I can't remember how it's phrased, but there's certain Title I funds that you can use specific for summer support. We haven't used them that way because we've just been putting everything under the ESSER 3 umbrella. But we could provide Title I, which is interventions for students. We could provide that level of supports and services. And I will mention that to Dawn Jones. She is now managing the Title I grants, and it wouldn't be a bad idea. It is a funding source. It's a grant, so you got to do the whole other side of that. But a lot of districts make use of those funds.
So that way, when you look at these results going forward, the results that we have in the spring might be a little bit worse than the results we get in the fall, because those kids have had additional support over the summer.
Right.
Which I think, at least that gives us a bit of a running start for some of these issues in the school year.
Yeah.
I just put that out there. I would just like to see us do everything we can to support those kids who are struggling, who are a couple grade levels behind. And I know just as one member of the board, but I imagine other people on the board would definitely want to allocate resources to help those kids who are struggling the most in our district.
Well, I almost wonder too, if maybe at a future meeting, I should have Dawn present to this board with because we've had a lot of meetings, but she primarily is the driving force. We've reimagined Title I, and she has come up with a way to really think about it as coordinated instruction, and how do we provide this interventionist support for students in the classroom and not just through a pull-out model. So that might be interesting to hear, and that's sort of a new idea that we're implementing this year. And so far, it sounds like all of the meetings that took place in the early workshops that started the school year went really well and are quite positive, which means we used to call them our Title I teachers. We're now calling them interventionists, the interventionists are working with grade teams, not just grade levels, but grade band teams in order to identify the classrooms that might need the highest level of support and being able to work with a group of students to provide interventions instead of just individual. It allows the interventionist to impact a lot more kids than just one-on-one individual work. They'll still provide that support as well, but we'll be able to get a higher level of intervention within the classroom for classrooms that do have that higher need. And there are some. When we look at this on my screen share, I have the grade levels here, but when we break that down and we start looking at classrooms, there are some classrooms that definitely show a higher need than other classrooms. Otherwise, we're just looking at averages across the district, but we look at our data at the classroom and the teacher level.
To put that in context, last year the board had a presentation from Justin Bennett about the model that they had at South School of this, you know, intervention in the classroom and peer coaching and so on and so forth. And what we're really doing is we're scaling that up district wide. So that was such a successful model for South School, it just made total sense to scale it up. So that's what Don's doing.
Yeah, that's great. I remember that presentation really well, John. I was really impressed with the work that was going on in South School, and I'm really glad we're scaling it for the whole district. Great.
I am just going to show you guys one more thing, and you can access this in the future. I'm one report behind, but we were 2.5 reports behind. So we're getting there. And usually I do this report in October anyways for the school year because it takes Joseph a little bit of time to pull all of the data. I will just show you really briefly. Let's see. I'm going to show you where to access this too. So from our RSU13 page under the curriculum tab, for the assessment data, you can link to it right here. You will see our data charts here. I've already updated our proficiency data. So by grade level, you can see all of the spring scores for math and reading. There wasn't a good way for me to do a comparison on there, but I'll show you another place where I'm going to be putting this data as well. Graduation rate has not been updated yet. I think we're still certifying that information, but as soon as we have it, that will be updated. Attendance, just waiting for a final count for last year's attendance. That will be in the report that Joseph gets to me. And then this student growth by grade has been updated. So those are all of your quick access charts. So these two on the far right are up to date. These two will be updated probably within the next 2 weeks. I just didn't have the data in time for this meeting. The assessment calendar you can access down here in case you're curious what assessments are we giving when. That's what teachers always access so that they know what's coming up. We do have the fall NUIA assessment coming up in early October through the end of October. That's our window. So we're prepping for that right now. But these are what I wanted to draw your attention to. I have been compiling these educational reports for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I think I've done this every year that I have been in this role. This one is not a live link yet, so know that that data will be coming soon. I have already updated all of the NUIA data in there, but there's some attendance data that I'm waiting on. But it's going to look exactly like this one from the previous year, except it will have the fresh data in it. This includes a table of contents with overall, as a district, how are we supporting students? What are our standardized measures showing? And then attendance rates. And then you can also dig in and see that based on each school. So these are all clickable links that will take you to each part of the document. But overall, again, MTSS, that multi-tier system of support, we're taking that from, we used to call it the RTI process, but now it's really centered around coordinated instruction. Our MEA data, that is now our NUIA assessment. So you'll see student growth tables on there. It's pretty much the same data that you're going to see from those little icons at the top, but it expands it quite a bit more. Our science data is on there as well. Again, this is not our most recent assessment. Those will be updated soon. And then our attendance rates. And in the 2022-2023 one, you'll have that added part of the table down here that will have last year's data, same with graduation rates. But then you'll see each schools, and there's a little overview from each principal, some pictures, ways that schools are supporting students, and then you'll see their school-based data. Every school has the growth. So how much did the students grow from fall to spring? That's the percentage of students that made their growth goal from fall to spring. And then you'll see the percentage of students that were performing at average or above. That's the exact data from the cohort study that I was just showing you. And then of course you'll have a chart like that for math, and you'll have a chart like that for reading. There's the chart for the MEA science. This is all the science from this particular year, 2021 to 2022 was all baseline data. So that we don't really, again, just like probably the NUIA data from the spring, we don't really have anything to compare that to. And then average daily attendance for each school, and includes the number of students considered truant. So hopefully we're going to continue to see the attendance increase and the number of truant students decrease, but certainly during COVID, those numbers seem to shift quite a bit. Jess Anderson has done a tremendous job of helping us dig even further into that data and finding not just our number of students that are truant, but also really looking at chronic absenteeism. So I won't go through this whole thing. I just wanted to show you where it is and where it's located, and that we have that report available, and that the report from last year is coming soon. I'm going to probably have that data from Joseph within the next 2 weeks, and it doesn't take me long to put it all together. So I will stop sharing. Any final questions?
It's a lot of data and a lot of work. Thank you, Stephanie, and everybody who works to put all that together. It's incredible.
Yeah, I agree.
It's incredible.
Full to have this information. I guess I'm curious, once we have it, like what are some actionable steps we can do to move the district forward and some of the goals that you and your administrative team have? And then a sub question to that is, how can the board support those goals and support your work in that? So, so I guess, having the data is great, but what we do with it is more important. And I hope that from Lauren and from me and others on the board that you have our full support to do whatever we can do to really move the district forward and increase those green bars and see what we can do to really particularly support the kids who are struggling the most.
Yeah, and just a reminder, one of the things that we do with that data for on the administrative team, we schedule trimester-based check-ins, and every building comes up with their building-based objective based on their school-specific data. So when there are board presentations from each principal, which we just scheduled those for this year, they're sharing what they're working on that's going to help them move the dial on that data. So probably the best answer that I can give is, from a board perspective, really supporting that work, recognizing the level of thought that administrators are putting into that work, and really finding ways to support that without having too many other distractions that are going on, because that work is incredibly important. And even visiting a school and checking in on their school-based objective. I think, I can't remember who I was talking to the other day, but it was one of our new principals, and she had asked, do board members ever come visit? And I said, they certainly can. They should ask you first, but they certainly should come visit. And I think people like that. I know staff always appreciates having, people come to the building and ask them questions, and, just simple, how are things going? And maybe carving out a little bit of time to meet with the principal and asking how their building-based objective is going.
Great. I've already reached out to Hillary to do that very same thing. I've already met with Shelby. So I'm with the two new principals. I'm there. The other three I have to go, do more of.
Perfect. Yeah. It sounds great.
Yeah. Good. All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Really appreciate that. And Bruce, thank you for your presentation as well. Any other final thoughts before we finish up today?
I'm just trying to sort it out in my head. I'll have thoughts later. Sorry.
That's all right. So since Carol wasn't here, I'll try to summarize this at the board meeting, but that's going to be at the beginning of October, right? Not the next meeting.
Right.
So I won't be at the next meeting.
Right.
So I'll summarize this. And Stephanie, you're not able to come to any of our meetings these days, right? So, okay.
Don't think I will be able to.
Okay. So I'll summarize this and make sure that the board has a good sense of all the good work you're doing.
Perfect. That sounds great. Well, thank you. And I know Carol had mentioned writing next time. I don't think it would be a bad thing for me to spend time on the website talking about where the standards are that I mentioned today, just so that you guys know how to access all the new standard language, but then I can dig into writing, and I'll work with Carol a little bit more too, and just see what specifically she wants to hear about writing, which is sort of 2 proficiency meetings in a row. But then I think after that, we can talk a little bit more about some other upcoming topics that you guys would like to see on the agendas.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right,
Okay.
great. Well, take care.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
See ya.
Take care.